Okay, so now we're going to talk about a concept which is called consumer surplus or producer surplus. And what this amounts to is we're talking about the amount of value obtained by the market when it reaches its equilibrium price. So I'm going to draw like a simple supply and demand graph here. Okay, so here's our quantity, here's our price. Okay, and we'll try to keep it color coded here nicely. So here's our supply curve. And here's our downward sloping demand curve. Okay. And now we've already talked about how, okay, the law of supply will keep our suppliers is supplying more to the market as the price increases. And we talked about how consumers will demand less. As the price increases, the quantity demanded will become less. We talked about some ways in which these curves would move, etc. But right now, all we're going to talk about is some of the properties of this magic point, which we call equilibrium. So here's our price at equilibrium, and here is our quantity at equilibrium. Okay, so you see, here we are. We've reached our intersection where suppliers have met consumers in the market, and we've got our equilibrium price and quantity. Now, so to understand this idea of surplus, whenever we see this consumer surplus, producer surplus, we're talking about surplus of value. We're not talking about, like up here where the price is high and everybody wants to supply more, and so we've got a surplus of physical goods. And this is where students can get a little confused sometimes because we're using almost the same term to refer to the same thing, to different things. So you've got a price up here, and we demand less than what's supplied, so we've got a bunch of stuff left over in the warehouse. That is called a market surplus. That's a surplus of goods and services over and above what people are willing to pay. What we're going to talk about here is, you see at this price here, okay, so we've met in the middle. But look along here. All these points here, there are people who would have paid more. Right? If we look at demand as what we called demand was the ability and willingness of consumers to pay, we are willing to pay more. Right? Like right at this price way up here, we would have had this number of people who would have been willing to pay that price for whatever this good is. This is a market for some particular good. It doesn't really matter what the good is. So this person, if we could say that a demand curve for a market is the combination of all the individual demand curves of all these different people, we could say that whoever would have been willing to pay this price is now actually only paying this price because that's the price given by the market. So all this in here is extra value. It's like when you go to the store and you, you want to buy a new gaming console, right? And you've got a few $100 or, $1,000 in your pocket, and you get to the store and you find out you would have taken every dollar you had and laid it down for that thing, but then you find out that it's only half price. Today it's a sale. It's $500. So you've actually received $1,000 worth of value for $500. So in that sense, we mean that there's a surplus of value that's acquired, and that's true all the way along here, right? There's always people who are willing to pay more, to pay more, to pay more, right? So if we ran this demand curve right up to the top, then what we've got here is a whole bunch of surplus value, right? So this is where we have our consumer surplus. And you may as well think of it as surplus value. Surplus value. So people are paying this price, but they would have been willing to pay this much, so they get sort of a surplus of value. So when you look at one of these graphs and you look at the market in equilibrium, we're saying we're maximizing here at equilibrium, at our equilibrium price, we are maximizing the possible value that all consumers in the market are receiving. So we're getting maximum consumer surplus. Now think of this down here. Okay, and let's run our supply curve right to the y-intercept. So these, same thing on this side, right? If we think of this, we can think of the supply curve right now as, you know, the price that they have paid in order to produce this, or the price at which they would have been willing to produce. Well, you see, we're getting this price, but we would have, you know, there's a small quantity of people who would have produced at this price. So they're actually making a lot more, right? So the producers that would have produced at this price are, you know, all those people are receiving a lot more. These people are receiving a lot more, all the way up here. So there's additional value that is gained by producers at this end. Let's just, you know, put let's just make that a little stronger so we can see it, right? And so this is all surplus value as well, and we're going to call that producer surplus. And again, I'm going to put the word value in parentheses here to indicate that when you look at this consumer surplus value and producer surplus value, it's additional value. We would have produced at this price, but we are actually getting this price. So we're getting so much more than we would have been able to produce until we reach the equilibrium. Now, you can readily see that, and what we call this overall, so between consumers and producers, right? So we can actually calculate this area. So we calculate that as the area of a triangle is 1/2 times the base times the height, right? So if we actually had prices marked in here, like let's say this is $30, this is $15, quantity is whatever, 700, you know, 700 is our equilibrium quantity, $15 is our equilibrium price. Well, we have the basis for calculating this. So what is the size of the consumer surplus? Well, the consumer surplus is going to be equal to 1/2 of the base. Okay, so base 700 times the difference between here and here is going to be 15, right? And that's how we're going to calculate that. Same thing with the producer surplus. We've got the base times the height. Let's say I don't know, this is about 5. So we've got, once again, producer surplus equals 1/2 of, let's see, 700, right? Our quantity, our base is 700. Our height is the 15 minus the 5, so times 10. And we can do that calculation there as well, right? So this one's easy for me to calculate. 1/2 of 7,000 equals 3,500. So the producer surplus is equal to 3,500 because we've calculated the area of this triangle. 1/2 of 7,000 times 15 is 1/2 of 700 times 15, 700, 7,000, 10,005. Let's see. Where do I have a calculator? Let's get a calculator in. Okay, so 700 times 15, 10,005. So equals 1/2 times 10,500, which equals 5,250. So the amount of the consumer surplus is 5,250 in this case. The amount of the producer surplus is 3,500, right? And what we've done here is at equilibrium, we have maximized the total surplus. So what we call this is we say this entire area of this triangle is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus is equal to what we could call the economic surplus or total surplus. Okay? So we have these two terms for this entire side of the triangle. And what you can see if you look at this, and we'll look at a couple of examples in the next video of how this might change. But you can see here that at equilibrium, we are getting the maximum economic surplus within the market. So this is one of the reasons why we say that a market equilibrium is allocatively efficient. Right? Allocative efficiency. So we've allocated goods in such a way that we have maximized the value to the market. And that's one of the ways in which a market equilibrium is allocatively efficient.